I think it is lovely to now shift the discussion to things which a lot of younger people think that they are interested in, opine about, and yet sometimes find themselves on slippery grounds arguing about those issues. And to have this session, this exciting session going on, the speaker with us is none other than Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai. Because it's my duty as the moderator of the session to formally give an introduction to Mr. Sardesai, but before I do that, may I request Dr. Vidya Yarwadekar, the Pro-Chancellor of SIU, to welcome Mr. Sardesai to the Symbiosis Literature Festival.
Thank you, Ruchi, and welcome Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai to Symbiosis once again. Though virtually this time, we've always found every occasion to invite you to interact with our students, and you've always accepted our invitation, and you've come to our campus on several occasions. So this is once again, Symbiosis is celebrating its Golden Jubilee in this year. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we couldn't conduct anything physically on campus, and we thought this would be the best way to have the Symbiosis Literary Festival virtually over the next 2 days. So this Lit Fest is not only attended by our students and our faculty members, but a large number of people from Pune and other places, and more importantly, our alumni from across the world were very excited to attend this virtual literary festival. We've also been having the Symbiosis Golden Jubilee lecture series almost every month since the month of July. And we've got excellent speakers for that too. So this is like a virtual treat to our students, and I don't think they could have expected anything else and anything more positive than this in this pandemic. All the students are more than eager to come back and join the university campuses, and so are we eager to receive them. But then we felt that till they come physically to the campus, let us give them the best as we can. And here you are, people like you, Shashi Tharoor, Shobha Day, and others speaking since the morning, Chetan Bhagat, and another few more speakers tomorrow. In the evening, of course, we have the Minister for External Affairs also who's going to talk to them at 5 o'clock. So Rajdeep ji, it's wonderful to have you, and we though of course all of us see you on television, debates, etc. But when you actually come and address our students, it's almost like a professor giving a lecture in a classroom. So I hope it's once again in the same fashion. And thank you once again. Over to you, Ruchi.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. We also have on the screen with us our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Rajni Gupte. Like I said, it is my duty as the moderator of the session to formally introduce Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai to our audience. Mr. Sardesai is a senior journalist, author, columnist, and news presenter with more than 30 years of experience in print and television news. Having begun his career with the Times of India in 1988, Mr. Sardesai moved to NDTV in 1994. He was the founder editor of the IBN 18 network, which started news channels like CNN IBN. He is currently a consulting editor with the TV Today network and anchors the flagship primetime show. Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai has won several awards for journalistic excellence, including the Ramnath Goenka Award, the International Broadcasters Prize, the Asian TV Award, and the Prem Bhatia Political Journalism Award in 2019 for his general election coverage. He received the Padma Shri in 2008. He is the author of 3 previous books: 2014, The Election That Changed India; Democracy's 11, The Great Indian Cricket Story; and Newsman, Tracking India in the Modi Era. Well, on 23rd May 2019, when the results of the general elections were announced, Mr. Narendra Modi and the BJP-led NDA coalition were voted back to power with an absolutely overwhelming majority. Irrespective of one's political standpoint, one thing was beyond dispute. This was a landmark verdict, one that deserved to be reported and analyzed with intelligence and without any bias. Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai's new book, 2019, How Modi Won India, does just that. Well, I saw Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai's Instagram profile just 4 or 5 days back. He talked about how the paperback edition of the book is now out, and it is also available on Audible, and very interestingly, a Hindi edition is coming out soon. So on that note, I will now request Mr. Sardesai to take the stage and narrate the election story to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruchi. I presume that we are going to do a question answer, or you want me to just speak?
So, sir, we have a lot of questions, frankly, from a lot of
So
students.
how long would you like me to speak for? That's
So I don't know. Once you'll start talking, I don't know. I shouldn't got in to stop you. But sir, if we can have like a 15-20 minute talk with you to begin
Sure.
with, yeah, that'd
Sure.
be great. Thank you so much.
Dr. Vidya, Principal Gupte, Ruchi, staff, students, and most of all, young friends. Thank you very much for once again inviting me to Symbiosis. It's very difficult to say no to Dr. Vidya. She's extremely persuasive. And Symbiosis is such a brand name that it becomes very difficult not to be part of an event organized by Symbiosis. I've had the privilege of working with students who come from the Symbiosis Institute of Mass Communications. So thank you very much for having me here and allowing me to speak on elections and not on the media. The reason I didn't want to speak on the media is that it's far too controversial at the moment and too close to the bone. But I'm happy to take any questions you may have on the media. I actually wanted to speak about my book. It's here, 2019, How Modi Won India. It's now available in paperback. And let me tell you why I have this sort of belief that one must write about elections. You know, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and there were some historic elections in that period. 1977 was the famous election where Indira Gandhi was defeated after the emergency. I was all of 12 years old. 1984 was again a tectonic election. Rajiv Gandhi got more than 400 seats, an overwhelming majority. These were the elections I remembered growing up. But when I tried to read about them and find out more about them, there was very little reading material. And on the 1977 election, there was just the odd book written by Janardhan Thakur, a very nice book called All the Prime Minister's Men. And there was a book by Kuldeep Nair, but there was much more about the emergency. Very few people had analyzed for me and told me, how did the mighty Indira Gandhi, the seemingly invincible Indira Gandhi, lose? Similarly, in 1984, very few people told me, how is it that Rajiv Gandhi, an airline pilot who had very little political experience, is able to win such an overwhelming majority? What impact did the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi have on that election? Quite simply, I don't think people thought of writing election stories, including journalists. And journalists are very privileged at times that we have a ringside view to history as it happens. But we chose, I think, in all those years, largely to basically read from newspapers. So what the newspaper said is what became our primary source of information. But to take it beyond the newspaper and tell the story of elections is something which I believe was a gap in Indian writing for the longest time. Every time there's a US presidential election, and there's one happening in a few days' time, there are about 20, 25 books that come out at the very least about Donald Trump, about his rivals, about how United States is changing. In India, we don't write enough. And for my young friends in particular, let me say this, we don't read enough. I think we need to read much more about what's happening around us, not just the 600 words or 800 words of a newspaper or the 250 characters of Twitter or what we see in Instagram or Facebook, but much more beyond that. And that's why I think it's important to write about the times in which we live. And which is why I set about, frankly, in 2014 to write, only because at that stage I had just left CNN-IBN. And, I was a little, what should I say? I was, in a way, traumatized by the fact that I had left a channel I had set up. And I think in that period of sadness and anger, I was looking for some kind of an outlet, and writing provided me that. So I used that period after leaving CNN-IBN. For the first time in my professional life, I had no job. So I said, let me sit down and write. And I wrote about the Modi election of 2014 because it was a historic election. The fact is that this was the first election where the BJP or a non-Congress party had got a majority. And I thought that since I had tracked Mr. Modi and his political career, in a sense, paralleled mine to the extent that I had met him in 1990, 2 years into journalism. when he was organizing the Rath Yatra. And today he was the Prime Minister of the country. I said, let me try and through this period, track how Indian politics has changed. So that's what I attempted in the 2014 book. And I wanted to give a face to the various characters, whether it's an Anna Hazare, Arvind Kejriwal, Narendra Modi, Nitish Kumar, Rahul Gandhi, Sonia Gandhi. I think we need to go beyond the names, and we need to sort of actually create portraits of them, see the mistakes they made, what they got right, what they got wrong. And it was a fascinating period, I thought, to that period leading up to 2014. And once I started writing, it just seemed to the words seemed to come out pretty spontaneously. I was very clear in my mind when writing both the 2014 and the 2019 book that I am writing it as an observer. I am not a Modi bhakt. I am not a Modi critic either. I am an observer. I have questions to ask him. I have criticism of the Prime Minister. I also appreciate some aspects of his politics. And I wanted to bring that sort of relatively dispassionate look at politics as an observer, as a relatively experienced journalist. But I was not an insider. I was not writing this book as an insider. I was not writing it. I had not been commissioned by Mr. Modi like many authors are. I had not been commissioned to sort of write a eulogy, and I was not going to write one. And that's what I did in 2014. 2019 was, again, I think inspired partly by my wife, who said, you must document this election, because Sagarika felt that, look at what Mr. Modi has done. He has, in the age when we think of anti-incumbency, that governments will be defeated, here is a prime minister being re-elected by an even bigger margin. So what explains that? And I sort of thought that, again, there was a story to tell. At the end of the day, I believe you must tell a story. An election book, I wanted to make this book accessible to those who may not be obsessed with politics. In fact, I was very happy a few months ago when someone just accosted me at the market and said, aren't you the person who's written this book? They said, yes. And this lady told me, I'm not into politics, but I read your book and I enjoyed it. And I thought it was important for us, it is important for writers to make their writing accessible. I don't write to win awards. I don't write because I'm going to win some award. Or what writing is a very personal experience, and you've got to make it accessible to the maximum number of people, which is what I set about doing in the 2019 book. What changed? In the 2014 book, I had Modi and Rahul Gandhi. Is the book here? Oh, 2014 ki kitab haas se dena. That had Modi and Rahul Gandhi. Now it is Modi and Amit Shah. There you have it. That's right. You have it, Modi and Rahul Gandhi there. Here's the paperback version. And this time it's Modi and Amit Shah. So the difference is actually Shah. Mr. Modi is still there. And in a way, I think this Gujarat Jodi number 1, as I call them in one of the chapters, is again a fascinating story. One of the images that that fascinates me is I was told by an old Gujarati journalist that the first time Amit Shah and Narendra Modi actually campaigned on an election together was 1987 Ahmedabad municipal elections. And they did it on scooter. Now, anybody who's been to Ahmedabad or any students from Ahmedabad will know Ahmedabad is the worst city to drive on a scooter. The riskiest city. It's a city I'm born in, a city I love greatly. But driving through those little bylanes, I was just imagining Amit Shah and Modi. And Mr. Modi was pillion. Amit Shah was driving him. And they were putting up posters on the wall. Please, people don't realize that politics doesn't happen overnight. It's for us in all professions. It's a gradual build-up. And therefore, Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah have been at this for 4 decades. They have mastered the art of election, of fighting elections simply by going on this journey for so many years and doing it election after election. It's a 40-year-old, you can call it tapasya, whatever you want to call it, but it has been a single-minded ambition to grow. That hunger to grow. And I think that is important to recognize, that it's not overnight. I think it's also important to recognize that elections have changed in this country. They've become much more presidential. People now ask not which party are you voting for, who's your MLA. People say, kisko vote doge, Modi or Rahul? It's not about, many people we found did not even know who their local candidate was. In fact, it's interesting, and this is some data in the book, that a third of the BJP voters, 1/3, 1 in every 3, said that they voted for the BJP only because of Modi. If Mr. Modi was not there, they may not have voted for the BJP. And think about it, if 33% of the BJP voters are voting only because of Mr. Modi, it is truly a presidential kind of election. Modi hai to mumkin hai. There is Modi only. I start the book with this story of this woman in Rai Bareli. She comes to the polling booth and creates a huge ruckus in front of the voting machine. Main nahi vote dungi. And she sits there almost in a dharna. So the poor officer comes there. Kya hua, madam, kya hua? She's 80 years old, doesn't know any language also very well. She said, nahi, ye aap log chori kar rahe hain. She said, why? What has happened? He said, nahi, ye election machine hai. हाँ तो है. The officer said, है. इसमें क्या problem है? He said, इसमें मोदी जी की तस्वीर किधर है? I want to see Modi ji's photo. He said, नहीं, but आप तो लोटस है, सिंबल है बीजेपी का, आप उनको वोट दीजिए. He said, नहीं, मुझे मोदी जी को वोट देना है. वहां वो कहाँ है? Eventually, she is told that Modi ji and the lotus, the BJP symbol is lotus. You can press the lotus symbol. Now, you see, this in a sense reflects how Indian elections have become presidential, and in that sense, to reflect on this transformation in our elections is just one of the trends that one has tried to capture. The other is the micromanagement of elections, what I call the WhatsAppization of elections. Today, the BJP, one of the reasons why it is such a powerful election machine, easily the most powerful election machine we've seen in this country, is because of the last mile connectivity. Now, there are 10 lakh booths in the country. The BJP had connected through WhatsApp more than 9 lakh of its booth karyakartas. Every booth had a WhatsApp group, and they were sharing information, disseminating it, and thereby creating local communities in a way. Now, this level of micromanagement, 160 call centers for 1 year before the 2019 elections, where the BJP had workers who would ring people up who were beneficiaries of government programs and remind them that they were beneficiaries of a government program. It could be a LPG gas under the Udan scheme. It could be, it could be various schemes of the government, but you were reaching out to the so-called Labharthis by setting up Labharthi Pramukhs. And those Labharthi Pramukhs would sometimes go and ring you up, go to people's houses, take a photo, and then put up the photo on Facebook. So that you also felt, chalo, yaar, the BJP person has come, taken a photo with me, and now has put it up on his or her site. Now, this level of micromanagement has never happened in the past. In a sense, in this mobile generation, you are changing the rules of campaigning. Earlier in the 1970s and 80s, there would be these big rallies. Today, I don't need the big rally. In fact, the virtual world is already there in elections. The last election saw people connecting more and more through WhatsApp. Political parties now use WhatsApp as a weapon. I call it a weapon of mass destruction at times, because you can spread all kinds of fake news also through WhatsApp. And fake news travels much faster than real news in real time. So the nature of elections in India is changing dramatically. And I think even if you're remotely interested in politics, I think it's important to understand how this change is taking place. It's also important to understand what has preceded an election. It's not just about voting day or counting day. It's about the build-up. How do you plan the mistakes you make? I keep saying Rahul Gandhi has never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. He has always found ways in which he is unable to recognize that you can't fight an election only on Twitter. or only on social media. You're going to have to build an organization. You need strategy. You see, the planning that goes into elections today is as important as the final result. It's like a student appearing for exams. You can't just, it's not what you do on the last day, it's how you build up to it. And I think that's what I've tried to capture both in the 2014 and the 2019 book. I've tried to give a sense of how elections in this country are transforming, how the characters involved in them are changing their roles, and thereby try and tell a crackingly good story. You need to bring people to life. I don't want them to just be, I hope 20 years from now, people will perhaps, as students will sort of want to know a little bit about the Modi era, because it is an era, a Modi Yuga, as I call it, that we are going through, and how politics has changed in this period. So, and a book provides you that. Let me end on this, that, television shows at the end of the day are now all about breaking news. When today's news is tomorrow's history. In fact, today's news is the next hour's history. Because everything is changing all the time. Breaking news is breaking down. So how do you then tell a story to an increasingly younger, impatient audience, which is watching Netflix, is Instagramming, Snapchatting, Facebooking? How do I hold them together? How do I explain them? I think it's important to explain what's happening around us. And I think that's what I've tried to do in these books. So I hope those who are not just passionate about politics, but interested in politics also read it. Because I think by reading these books, you may get a sense of how this country has changed in the last decade. It's a fascinating period to live through India. And, I guess as a journalist, one has been privileged to have that opportunity to observe this changing India. It's a completely new world out there, and that's what I've tried to bring out in these books. And there are, and make it anecdotal. I think books have to be anecdotal, not too much of theorizing, not bhashan baji, but try and talk, talk to audiences, not talk at the reader. That's what I've tried to make an effort to do. So I'm very happy to take questions and discuss any aspect of the book or anything that you wish to talk about.
Thank you so much, sir. That was really a nice background to your entire journey into why you wrote. And also, I think in a lot of ways, an emphasis on why journalists should write books. And I think that's something that's extremely important to articulate. I just have one question because I don't want to take away the spotlight from the students because they have a lot of questions, but I just have one question. I've read your 2014, the election that changed India. In fact, I have an autographed copy of yours because you had released that book at Symbiosis. But I also have a question. The last chapter of that book is called a tsunami. It's a tsunami. That's the last chapter of that book. Did you know that there was a sequel that is in the anvil in 2019?
No, look, the one thing I have learned in this country, and I think the last year should teach this to us, is in India, live in the present. Never predict the future. At the start of this year, India Today magazine asked me to write an article for them, Politics 2030. What will it look like 10 years from now? Now, when I look back at that was written in January. Just look at what's happened in 2020. How the world has changed. Did we think in our wildest imagination that this would be the year of the global pandemic? Everything else would sort of, be pushed to the background. Never predict the future. So it was a tsunami that took place in 2014. Could I have predicted a similar verdict in 2019? I don't think so. But I did do one thing. In the first week of May 2019, the elections were 23rd, first week of May 2019, having traveled across the country, I did a video blog. Now I'm learning video blogs. Did a video blog where I said, Mr. Modi will get more than 300 seats. And I put it out on Twitter or wherever else. I have also broadcast it. So it's not as if I'm saying it today. And, people see me as a Modi critic. And I keep telling them, if I was a Modi critic, would I say 15 days before the election, Mr. Modi will win more than 300 seats, NDA will win more than 350? So I think, look, predicting elections is hazardous. I would not claim that I've got every election right, but I think I have understood that today the BJP has been able to master the art of presidentializing an election. And the Congress, as I said, has never lost an opportunity to lose an opportunity.
Yeah.
So when you have two such distinct forces, barring something really unexpected, the BJP is in most elections in pole position. But look at Maharashtra. Who would have thought last year in Maharashtra that after the election you would have the kind of government that you've got? Never predict in India. Never.
Right. Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to also let you know that our Honorable Chancellor, Dr. S.B. Mujumdar, has also joined the session. So I just wish to acknowledge his presence, and he's here.
Namaskar, Dr. Majumdar.
Namaste. Thank you for time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. With this, I think the backdrop is all set, the stage is set, and we have a lot of student questions which have poured in. I'll try my best to do justice to as many questions that can be asked in this session. So may I request the students whose names I will call out to keep their questions short, be a little quick so that more students get an opportunity to ask their questions, okay? The first person I'll ask to come on camera and unmute themselves is Ashish Chandra from Symbiosis Institute of Media and Communication. Ashish, please go ahead.
So my question is, in your book, How Modi Changed India, 2019, we come across the real politics side of Mr. Amit Shah. Do you think as India moves forward, the politics of India has changed forever, with BJP now replacing Congress as the default party of choice? Thank you, sir.
Oh, absolutely. There is no doubt in my mind that the BJP today is the principal pole of Indian politics. And, one of the statistics that stands out is that there were about 192 seats in India where there was a BJP versus Congress direct fight. And the BJP won 175 of them. An average margin was more than 20%. In a way, it reflects just the decline of the Congress, but also the rise of the BJP. Amit Shah is a fascinating character. Let me tell you a story, which is a story to beat all stories about Amit Shah. The first election that Amit Shah contested was a student election in Gujarat. It was for not a classroom monitor, but like a class representative. So on the evening before the election, one of his friends told me, Amit bhai, you are losing. He was contesting against a woman. So he said, why am I losing? He said, no, all the girls are voting with her. So you are losing this election. There are more girls than boys in the class. So what do Amit Shah and his friends do? They prepare a note. This is pre-mobile days, 1980s. They prepare a note which they get the addresses of all the girls' parents, all the girl students' parents. And they send her there that don't send your daughter tomorrow to college because during the election there could be violence. They also then ring up many of them and say, don't send your girls to college tomorrow, there could be violence. Next day, elections are held. Half the girls don't come to class. Amit Shah wins by 15 votes. Please understand, now some will say evil, some will say genius, some will say that, this is crafty. Others will say, look at it, Sam, Dam, Danda, Bhed is the nature of politics. So Amit Shah, unlike Mr. Modi, comes from a more wealthy family. He comes from a more privileged background, has a family with a closely knit family. So he, to my mind, is the Svengali, the altar in a way does for Mr. Modi the things that Mr. Modi won't do. So it's a perfect Jodi. That's why I said Jodi number one. So Amit Shah is a more fascinating character in many ways. That someone from privilege, someone from a well-established house is ready to do the dirty work of politics. Politics is a lot of dirty work. To win an election is not as is no easy feat. But Amit Shah has done it over the years. So Amit Shah is a fascinating character, and I try and bring out some aspects of Amit Shah in the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll now ask the next student, Hannah John from the Undergraduate School of Media and Communication, Symbiosis Center of Media and Communication. Hannah, if you could just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, sir. I hope you're doing well. This is an area of politics that I absolutely love and have been very keen on writing. My question is with regards to your books following the two very interesting elections in India. Why do you think that the voter behavior differs during district and state elections versus the national elections? And how has that difference led to a long-term success for the BJP and their almost worship-like mass appeal?
See, one of the more interesting things is the Indian voter. You know, in 2019, I'll give you an example. In Haryana, the BJP got 58% of the vote. So they swept Haryana, won all 10 Lok Sabha seats there. 4 months later, state elections are held. The BJP loses 23% vote, ends up with 35% of the vote. There's a hung assembly, which means that almost 1 in 3 BJP voters who had voted for the BJP in the Lok Sabha doesn't vote for the BJP just 4 months later. The Indian voter is transactional. You know, he's either emotional or he gets transactional. I think in a Modi election, what Mr. Modi has successfully done is emotionalize the voter, given him a sense that, you know, this is not, you're not just voting for me, you're voting for a larger idea of Hindutva or a larger idea of nationalism. And especially after Balakot happened last year, Mr. Modi was able to convey the impression of a machismo leader, kind of an Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was, forget by ghar mein ghus kar mara hai, is how he put it. So that voter got emotionalized. Then comes a local election 4 months later, where the voter decides to vote on bread and butter issues. Ki Haryana, who is my best local candidate? So the same election which is presidentialized in Lok Sabha becomes localized in a state election. So voters by their very nature are emotional and transactional. And I think therefore, that is why I say you can never predict an Indian voter. Right. The same voter in Maharashtra, for example, who voted for the BJP Shiv Sena in the Lok Sabha, in many constituencies did not vote for them. So voters, the understanding the voter's mind and voter behavior is another, is a Chinese puzzle to beat, or it's inscrutable, the Indian voter. And I think the voter makes very, very conscious choices depending on the nature of the contest. So I think the BJP benefited from Mr. Modi's larger than life image in a Lok Sabha election, but in a state election where the elections are fought on more local issues, the party in power struggles because the voter often blames whichever is the party in power for whatever has gone wrong in their lives. So it's again fascinating. And I hope that more and more people will try and understand and grapple. One day do a book on just understanding the mind of the Indian voter.
Right. All right. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah. Mayuk Sen from the Symbiosis School of Economics had the next question. I don't see him in the participants list. Oh, there he is. Mayuk, hi. Unmute yourself, Mayuk, and please go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Sir, I would like to ask that realizing the power that social media plays in the election season, for instance, we have the recent discourse about how the Facebook, the social media giant Facebook did not curb hate speech because of their business. How do you think, sir, it will impact over the years in Indian context, in Indian election context?
See, I think, let's be honest, we are in the social media age. Social media has a very, very important role at times in shaping the narrative because more and more people today are hooked onto social media. We have not just social media, but messenger services like WhatsApp. We have 400 million WhatsApp accounts. We have 300 million now Facebook accounts in the country. We have about 150 to 200 million Twitter accounts. So just think about it. There are 90 crore voters and there are 300 million Facebook accounts. So that is 30 crore Facebook accounts, 90 crore voters. Assume that in any election, about 75 crore voters vote, 70 crore vote. That means virtually 1 in every 2 could well be someone who has a Facebook account. So the influence that they have is disproportionate. Why only this TikTok? Even TikTok has a huge influence. You see, TikTok and all these sites, these social media sites, can either amplify the noise, or they can, end up sort of almost ridiculing one side and exaggerating the power of the other. And that's what's happened. This whole Pappu, Rahul Gandhi is seen as a Pappu. The BJP has very, very carefully, consciously, and deliberately spread whatever they can to send out the message कि Rahul Gandhi Pappu hai. और मोदी जो है, मोदी है तो मुमकिन है. That was the tagline on social media. So social media can play that role of changing, of influencing the narrative. And there is no control on social media. I can, at the end of the day, a newspaper or a TV channel, there are some editorial filters. Here, there are no editorial filters. So you can create Facebooks, you can create fake Facebook sites, you can create Twitter trends. You have all these IT armies. Now, I think, therefore, they are necessary. Any candidate needs them, but they are not sufficient. I don't believe that you can win an election only through social media. You need a ground game. The BJP doesn't win only because of social media. They also win because on the ground, with their booth committees, they are able to do the last mile connectivity. So if you think you can win an election only on Facebook, only on Twitter, no. But it is necessary to be on it. Now, Rahul Gandhi was not on Twitter and Facebook till 2016-17. Only now he's realized the power of it. Till then, they looked down upon it, while Modi was on it from 2009 and 2010. So he was embracing it. You have to embrace social media. It's another weapon. देखो ये चुनाव महायुद्ध है. ये साम दाम दंड भेद से लड़ा जाता है. You need every weapon that you can use. Every hathiyar, as they call it. So I think in that sense, social media has a role. More and more candidates are using it. It's very necessary, but it's not sufficient.
Thank you so much. I'll now call out the next student, Varuni Trivedi, from the Symbiosis Institute of Media and Communication. Varuni, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, sir. We know that media is the fourth pillar of democracy, and elections are a very huge, most important part of it. Now, when we talk about the world's largest democracy, which has around 70% of the population resides in the rural areas, we see a lot of disparities, especially in terms of rural reportage with respect to mainstream media. Now, so why do you think that is the case? And do you have any guidelines for budding journalists as myself to work on this?
Well, firstly, you said elections are the most important aspect of democracy. I'm going to differ with you. Elections are the festival of democracy. No doubt about it. But the most important aspect of democracy is institutions. Whether it's the media, whether it's our courts, whether it's the legislature. And frankly, that is where we have failed today. The media doesn't tell truth to power today. It does Surya Namaskar to those in power. Even the Supreme Court has become a bit of an executive court. Now, that's another question and a debate for another day. But look, there is a rural-urban divide that exists in our lives. But as we saw during the pandemic, large numbers of people who live in our cities, who have built our cities, our roads, our bridges, our buildings, are from rural background. What happened? The moment the pandemic was announced and they were told stay at home, their home was back in the village. They all went and walked their way back home. So we are, I don't believe that we can divide ourselves so easily, rural, urban. India is a melting pot. And in a melting pot with a diverse society, I don't think we can sort of create boxes. ये rural voter है, ये urban voter है. ये rural voter जो है, ये भी सब कुछ जानता है. Today, whether it is Facebook, Twitter, they may not be there in deep rural Bihar, but people get information. So I believe that you cannot today take any voter for granted, whether it's rural or urban. And more Indians are aspirational. Every person in India, it's the biggest recurring theme in India. India is a land of, in my view, the most aspirational society in the world. People want a better life for their children. They want a dream. Mr. Modi has been very successful in that. in giving people a sense of hope. Now the sense of hope may vary. कि मेरे घर में मेरे गांव में टॉयलेट नहीं था इतने सालों से. If I get a toilet, that's a way of getting of giving people a sense that their lives could get better. So I would divide India as into boxes, but yes, the rural voter has a different understanding to an urban voter at times. His issues may vary, but at the end of the day, there is a deep connect across this country.
Sure, thank you. And I'll now call out Pranoti Abhyankar of the Symbiosis Center of Media and Communication. Again, the student from our undergrad media school. Pranoti, would you please unmute yourself and ask your question if you're there? I did see you though in the participants list.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is related to the interviews. So while conducting an interview, how do you handle an antagonistic interviewee as a journalist?
Okay, how do I handle that? Very badly. There are all kinds of memes on me on how people are attacking me all the time. I am and one your earlier participant also asked me about budding journalists. Look, I am passionate about news. So even when I go into an interview, I go with that passion. Sometimes I end up interrupting a guest. So the guest gets angry and then will say something. But I have always believed that my job is to ask questions to whoever.
Right.
At times I've not succeeded. I'll give you an example. Sonia Gandhi, I interviewed her in 2016. Now, just before the interview was to start, she said, no political questions. There will be no political questions. Now, what do? Here is a politician telling you before the interview, no political questions. So my interview just didn't work. So there are times when, much as you would like to ask all the questions, you don't get that opportunity. But how do I handle an antagonistic guest? By smiling. I think one of the things is life. There is more to life than an interview. So when you're in the interview, you're asking the questions. If someone is rude to you, you just smile. I don't like being, I don't like this tutu meme that happens on TV. See, we have converted TV into a tamasha. Let's be honest, nautanki. That's not what TV was meant to be. I'll give you an advice that the great R.K. Lakshman, who has a big association with Symbiosis, one gave me, and he and I were in the same space at the Times of India. He was in the next cabin when I started in journalism. He said the journalist must never become the story. You are a storyteller. You are not the story. You must not make your ego take over. So I don't want to get into an ego battle with a guest. I keep telling young people, just be storytellers. Just be a curious mind. Just go out there and be a curious mind, interested in finding out more about life. And believe that life is a journey where every day is a new day. In fact, Mr. Lakshman gave me one other advice. I asked him, how do you, sir, do a cartoon every day for so many years? Don't you get bored? He said, I treat every cartoon as the first cartoon I'm doing. And sometimes I do that with TV. I see every show as the first show I'm doing. On COVID, I didn't know anything about health. My son is a doctor, but I have very little idea of health. But I've spent the last few months learning about it because it's a new experience. So if you treat life as a journey, as a new experience, my friends, you will always discover new things about yourself and discover more things about the world. And I think that makes a half-decent journalist.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for that amazing sentence that you used, that the journalist shouldn't become the story, but the journalist is always the storyteller. I think in the current news narrative that we see, that is the truth that's totally lost. However, I'll now call out the next student who is Shraddha Tiwari from Symbiosis Institute of Media and Communication. Shraddha, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Okay. So as journalists, we often have to justify the intent behind asking a question. We sometimes are putting out a disclaimer that for the sake of argument, I'm asking you this, and we elicit an answer. So what has pushed journalists towards adopting such an approach?
No, I don't think that journalists have to justify anything. I know that journalist reputation, especially TV journalist reputation, has taken a big beating in recent times. But that's because we made the mistake, and I include myself here at times. We cannot become the story. You see, a journalist is, my definition of a journalist is the boy or girl who goes to a press conference, pad, paper in hand, pen in hand, asks all the right questions, gets the answer, comes back, does the story. When I started off in journalism in the late 80s, the byline was by a staff reporter. You know, we wrote a book, all the journalists of Times of India, the city team in Mumbai, wrote a book on the 92-93 Mumbai blasts and riots called When Bombay Burnt. But we were not famous, we were not on TV, so the book was not read by many people. But we still enjoyed the idea of putting a book together. Today, my name is bigger than the book title. I don't know why, but the publisher says, "Nahi, it will sell on your name." Why? Because I'm on TV. If I was not on TV, people may not even read the book. So you see, I think journalists have to recognize that we are here to ask questions. We are here to tell stories. We are not here to become the story. We don't have all the answers. You see, what has happened is we have replaced facts with opinion. I think that is the real danger. When you say you have to justify, I think the real danger is that where we were supposed to tell the facts, we now express our opinion. And that divide is where we've got ourselves into trouble in recent times.
Right. Thank you. I'll now request Soham Shah of the Undergrad Media School, the Symbiosis Center of Media and Communication, to unmute. Soham, go ahead. Please ask your question.
Hello, sir. My question is, of the numerous elections that you have covered, which in your opinion was the most interesting?
The next one. I'm going to Bihar next week. First election in COVID times. That will be interesting. Look, you know, elections are fascinating. But it is very, I'll tell you one election that fascinated me. And this is pre-television era. 1990 in Maharashtra, in Mumbai, there's a place called Umar Khadi. Umar Khadi is Mohammad Ali Road, where one side you have Bhindi Bazaar, one side you have Kalba Devi. And there was a Shiv Sena candidate versus a Muslim League candidate. And this is pre-electronic voting machines. And both candidates were trying to rig the election. They were both getting their people into the polling booths and chapawing their on their symbol. This is before you were born, probably, young man. That in the pre-electronic voting age, there was massive rigging was going on. Me and my cameraman managed to capture some of the rigging. While we were leaving, a mob surrounded us. And in those days, we only had paper and pen. They snatched our paper and pen. They tried to break my cameraman's photograph. They beat him up on the head. And we reached office. He was bleeding. And I had to write my copy. To my mind, that election was a wake-up call. Election ke liye kuch bhi karega kind of attitude. So lots of elections I remember, but that stands out in my mind. But lots of, going with Lalu Prasad, being made to feed. Lalu Prasad Yadav taught me how to milk a cow. He said, tumko interview chahiye, you will first have to learn how to milk a cow. This is early 90s, 94, 95, where I am from South Mumbai, Lalu teaching me how to milk a cow. Now, this can only happen in India. So, lots of similar elections, but I would say that experience of 1990 in Umar Khadi. I remember, I think Bashir was the name of the Muslim League candidate who won actually. The election in that area was countermanded after our story in that booth. But that was a real, Mahayudh kind of election.
Great. Thank you. Before I ask the next student to ask a question, I have a question, sir, to ask of you.
Sure.
So how do you see the role of a psephologist kind of getting reconfigured in this new wave in which the entire narrative around elections and in a democracy like ours is built?
See, I think one of the things is that we've never had rules for psephologists. In Britain, what happens is the data is common and interpretation of the data is left to each psephologist. So Gallup will do the data and then each psephologist based on Gallup's data will do their exit polls. In India, everyone is a pollster and everyone is going out there charging money for these polls. We don't know how effective their polling mechanisms are. What has now happened though is it's getting to the point where earlier we used to do random sampling. If there are 200 constituencies, you go to 30 constituencies and you pick up what is happening in the remaining 170 based on those 30. Today, now pollsters are having to go to each constituency because especially in the Vidhan Sabha election, the voting patterns can change constituency from constituency unless it's a wave. So I think psephologists also need to raise their game. You know, Indian politics is now much more complex. Someone doesn't get a ticket, stands as an independent. Independent may pick up 10,000 votes and defeat one of the major candidates as a result. So you have, as politics gets more competitive, it's much more difficult to predict also. And therefore, even psephologists need to up their game. And frankly, they haven't done so yet. We have a very good one at the moment from Axis My India called Pradeep Gupta. And my book actually starts with the story of Pradeep Gupta, who's an interesting character because, he had no real background in psephology, but he's got the last few elections spot on. So, and he goes constituency by constituency, interviewing 100 people in each constituency. So, there are different models, but they certainly need to improve the level of accountability and transparency of psephologists.
Sure. Thank you for that. In fact, I'll ask the next student to also ask her question, but we had one question that came from a lot of students. I thought I wouldn't ask that question, but since we have a little more time, so there's this question that came from at least 4 to 5 students. That was, sir, why did you not become a cricketer? That was a question that I kept getting in my...
Very simple answer. For which they can read my book, Democracy is 11, which is personally my favorite book in a way, especially if you're a cricket. Yeah, that's right. It's now in paperback and it's coming out in different languages also. But cricket needs talent. Journalism does not. I often say, if you have failed in everything else, there's always journalism. I was trained to be a lawyer. I found it too difficult. I came to journalism. I was desperate to become a cricketer. I realized it needs talent. I didn't have it. I became a journalist. My father became a test cricketer without having any formal coaching till the age of 18. And he played within 3 years of that for India. Now, that can only happen if God has given you talent. It can't happen otherwise. Of course, your own hard work and effort. But lots of people put hard work and effort. Talent is something which I think the sports person is the true genius. When I see Nadia Comaneci, the gymnast, do all those things on a balance beam, I used to try and do that. I could never do it. How did she do it? And today, when you see swimmers and chess players, that's true talent. So the short answer is, I just didn't have the talent.
All right. I'll now request Ramya Kaushik of Symbiosis Institute of Media and Communication to unmute herself and ask her question. So Ramya, if you're online, go ahead, please.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, my video is disabled.
That's okay. Okay, IT team can help there. Yeah.
Yeah. Shall I ask my question?
Go ahead. Go.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. So, sir, as we were talking about elections, so my question to you is that how difficult it is to come up with exit polls and what kind of challenges are there while presenting exit polls in one of the most accurate ways?
It's a nightmare. I would never do it. I leave it to the pollsters. Just think about it. If it's a single phase poll, right? If it's in a state like Maharashtra, where in one day the entire state is voting. And while voting is going on, even because voting now goes on sometimes till 6 p.m., 6:30, television channels at 6:37 are already predicting the results. Frankly, I find it impossible to predict, or I find it difficult to believe that someone can predict accurately. So exit polls are a nightmare. However, I do think that the system is slowly getting better, but Indian voters lie. झूठ बोलते हैं, especially Tamil Nadu voters. The one state which is a nightmare for every exit poll is Tamil Nadu because you have two fronts, DMK and AIDMK, with a 30% guaranteed vote each. So it's the balanced 10% of floating voters in Tamil Nadu who decide. Now, who is to know how to find those balanced voters? And many of them lie. Indian voters are often scared to say that they are voting against the ruling party. So exit polls are a nightmare, but on TV we have to do them because what will you do otherwise on the night of the voting?
Though you very categorically said that you don't want to talk about what's happening on TV right now, especially with TV news, but with all that has happened and all that's happening now with the TRP fudging controversy and everything around it, it'll be great to hear something from you on the subject.
Okay. I am not Narendra Modi or Sonia Gandhi. I take whatever questions are asked to me. Our politicians don't take questions anymore. They only give us the answers. Look, I think the chickens have come home to roost. 160 million cable and satellite homes, plus you add terrestrial homes, 200 million. That's about 80 crore 800 crore Indians. Is it 8? What am I saying? 80 crore Indians. 80 crore Indians, 800 million Indians who are watching 150 to 160 cable and satellite homes. Plus terrestrial, it's about 180, 190. And we have just 44,000 boxes in 44,000 households measuring who is watching what. Out of which English news, for example, will be barely 1,000 or 1,500 people. 1,000 or 1,500 people. So if in a city like Mumbai, I can even fix 5 or 10 boxes, I will be the #1 channel of Mumbai. So the system was designed in a way to allow for it to be, in a way, infiltrated, exploited, and abused. And I think it's tragic that it has reached a criminal investigation, and that you have journalists being caught out in this manner. I don't think we want. I don't believe in TRPs, honestly. I know this may sound as if I'm standing on some, but I genuinely believe that TRPs must stand for television respect points. When I joined this profession in Times of India, we didn't have TRPs or anything. And even in early days of television, there was no TRP. We were there to tell a story. I come back to it. It's about storytelling. And it's not about, if I wanted to do TRPs, I should have become Shah Rukh Khan and done a film like Ekta Tiger and said, mere 300 crore ho gaye. TV is not TV news is not box office. Journalism is not box office. Right? But as I said, our egos have become so big. We have become the story. So we want to say, we are #1. This week, we are #1. So the moment you make moment you get into this #1 game and TRPs take over, then I think the profession loses some of its core. And the core of a profession of journalism, according to me, is at the end of the day about telling a story effectively. Now, I hope that lots of people watch it. Of course, we all want our stories to be watched. But I don't want to be measured only by TRPs. And I think, hopefully, there's a very nice cartoon which has come the other day. TRPs have now been stopped for 12 weeks by the broadcast. So the journalist comes to the editor and says, sir, ab 12 hafte ke liye there is no TRP. Can we now start doing news? For 12 weeks, we don't have TRPs. Can we now come back to doing news? Because TRPs converted news into tamasha. See, if there is a cockfight going on, if someone is shouting on the road, you will go and see what's happening. If people are walking peacefully, you won't see it. But news is not noise. News is not sensation. It's about sense. And unless we recognize this, television in particular is facing a huge credibility crisis. So I hope that we emerge out of it stronger. I hope that this period is used as a reset for TV also.
Right, right. Thank you so much for that very, very insightful response to this question. Also, before I sum up the session and deliver a very formal vote of thanks, sir, I really want you to give some motivation to these young students of ours who are pursuing journalism. Frankly, in the last year or so in particular, what I see as heading a journalism school is a very dying interest in joining television news. So while I understand that they could be very, very saturated with what they see on television, if they do not join, how would change even get initiated? So in that context, coming from someone like you, I think it will go and hit their souls. And I would really want you to talk about it. Thank you.
Sure, I'll give you a final comment. Look, at the end of the day, I don't watch TV news. So I'm going to give that caveat at the start. I believe two people should watch TV news. If you have low blood pressure and you want to increase your blood pressure, or if someone in your family is in coma and needs to be woken up, those are the circumstances you should watch TV news in. I prefer not to, but I'll tell the young students this. You have to be the change you want to see. And therefore, if you believe in yourself, you are confident that you can do a kind of journalism that makes a difference. There is no reason why TV is still a very, very powerful medium. We keep talking about we are in the digital age. All that is true. But even digital news is so fragmented. There are so many websites, blog sites. TV at the end of the day is there in everyone's room, in everyone's house. So therefore, if you want to have impact, you do need television. What we need is better television. We don't need more media, we need better media. And you are the next generation. You are technologically savvy, you are idealistic, you are very energetic. And therefore, if you can bring all that to the table, I don't see why you can't be the change. Look, young India, we brought out, I would like to believe we were part of a revolution that revolutionized TV. We broke the monopoly of Doordarshan. But taking the revolution to the next level is your challenge. You are the young who will use technology, and you must be multimedia. Let's be honest. Why only TV? TV, digital, print become multimedia. This is the multimedia generation. And I think COVID has taught us a lot. And one of the things that COVID has taught me is that you never stop learning. I mean, I had no clue of using technology till in the COVID age. I'm working from home most of the time. So I'm forced to use technology. I mean, first time I used Zoom, I was a mess. But now I've realized how to use Zoom. So I think young people must recognize that we are all on this journey of constant self-improvement. And please, if you join TV, join it because you want to make a difference. Join it because you are passionate about breaking news and live stories. Please don't join it because you want to be famous. One of my young journalists, a girl called Tanushree Pandey the other day, did a fantastic job in Hathras. If the Hathras story has come to light, it is because Tanushree stayed that night, used her mobile in such an effective way, getting the pictures of that cremation taking place at midnight against the family's wishes. Now, if she is 26 years old, so if she can do it, you can do it.
On that extremely, extremely inspiring note, I would also like to tell you that we have been not just joined by our media school students, we just gave them a little more opportunity to ask those questions to you, considering the context. We have students from engineering, management, health sciences, and all other design, architecture, all the other faculties of Symbiosis who are watching you both on Zoom as well as on YouTube. So, one, thank you so much for being you, Mr. Sardesai. Every time that we hear you, every time that you have come to the campus, I think all the sessions that we've had with you when you speak, I think to say the least are always goosebump inducing, right? So thank you for keeping that spirit alive always and inspiring these young people to always stay passionate about news. You said a lot of things that all of us will take away. The first thing that I'll remember from you is that the journalist shouldn't become the story, but always stay the storyteller. Also, your life is always more than an interview and beyond that. In addition to that, you said something very nice, which was that every show that you are on every night is like the first show for you. So the passion about news, passion for journalism is something that you resonate in who you are. And I think you inspired a lot of students by your sentence when you said that we don't need more media, we need better media. And for that, a lot of these young people have to get into the mainstream. And eventually, I think we all have to understand that news is not sensation, as you said, but news is about sense. And I hope that we are all able to critically look at our own ways in which we perceive news to become these more sensible audiences, which is also extremely important as a responsibility. While I'll remember television respect points and look at it like with greater spirit, but when you said journalism is not box office, the memory that came to me was Akshay Kumar interviewing Narendra Modi and talking about mangoes, right? So I really think that, you know, these are things that should stay with us as the fundamental pillars that uphold the values that journalism has always stood for and will always stay for. So on that note, on behalf of our Chancellor, Dr. S.B. Mujumdar, our Pro-Chancellor, Dr. Vidya Yarwadekar, our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Rajni Gupte, and Dr. Anita Patankar, who is hosting the Literature Festival, and all the students and faculty colleagues and staff of Symbiosis International University, I'm deeply grateful to you for having spared your time and addressed us in the most passionate way that you always do. Thank you very much, Mr. Sardesai.
Thank you very much. The only condition is all your students have to pick up a copy of the book and they have to read it.
Yes.
They have to read it.
That we'll certainly do. That we'll certainly do.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much again, and all the very best to the entire team at Symbiosis. Keep doing the kind of work you all do. Keep educating young minds and inspiring them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. You have a great evening, sir.
Dr.
Thank you.
Gupte. Thank you, Dr. Vidya.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.